There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
I'm here for a very exciting conversation with a very exciting writer, Barb Howard. Welcome back to my channel.
Hi, Shawn. Happy to be here again.
We're here to talk about novellas that Barb has written herself, novellas that Barb and I have read and really enjoyed. And what the heck is a novella, speaking in the terms of genre and in the grand scheme of all things literary? Farther along in the chat, we're going to share 3 of our favorite novellas and talk about them at some length, with the idea that we're going to come back and have a second chat in a couple of months, 2 or 3 months later, and we will have read at least one of the novellas on the other person's list, maybe more than one, but at least one, and chat further about some of the ideas about what makes a novella, what is specific and precisely going on in a novella that might be different from a short story or a novel. But once having read at least one more novella, we're going to come back and continue the discussion. I read Barb's novella, Happy Sands, last year, loved it, read it again this year. So I've read it twice. And I've had Barb on my channel before to talk about her writing, especially this novella, but we thought that maybe a more general chat would be interesting about novellas, because not only is Barb a novellaist, a writer of novellas, but she's an enthusiastic reader thereof. So, Barb, how should we get started?
Oh, well, talk about what a novella is. Maybe everybody knows on your channel, but if not, and that's probably the hardest question we'll have.
I'm just going to say, I hope you know, because it's longer than a short story and shorter than a novel, right? That's basically the rule of thumb, but that is a very subjective thing.
Yeah, that's right. So things have changed since I started writing. I think a novella that was way more wishy-washy, but if on the internet now, it's sort of like, or publishers advertising 10,000 words, over 10,000 words, but less than 40,000 words is often the length of a novella.
And I don't think in terms of words, because I'm not a writer. How many pages would that be between and?
Yeah, that would be between
book.
about, I guess, 100, no, it'd be less than that, about 60 to 130, 140.
Oh, okay. And
yeah.
in my mind,
it's print and book size and all those kinds of things. But I think it's landed in this kind of more specific area because of so many novellas now, maybe always. I'm not up on it on speculative fiction, but lots of that is in the novella category. I see the award for a world fantasy novella is 10,000 to 40,000 words. Okay. And I guess maybe we should say that before we even get going, that we decided not to talk about that genre. But I do think it is like at the forefront of novellas, and my job in the future would be to read more of that. Like it always has been, Ursula Le Guin, that sort of thing. I just don't want to do the podcast and not mention how important all of those are.
Absolutely, and I think that we agreed, maybe I dragged you kicking and screaming to agree with that, because I'm not a reader of genre fiction. So we're going to be focusing on commercial and especially literary novellas.
Yeah.
Is there any other way to define what a novella is other than page count or word count?
So I would have said highly specific setting, a few characters, one overriding thing or a theme or obstruction. And I could name a novella that does not have those things, but in general, that, if you were looking for advice from a writing class, something, they would say something like that. So we were talking earlier, I said, I do a spine test is one way to know if you've got a novella or not. And then I have 4 spines of different books. There's the spine test. Short story, very thin. This is from her collection. So they took it out once it was a movie and everything and started selling it as what in prose or poetry we'd call it a chapbook. It's just a single small short story. So then next to that, this book. This is the first novella I wrote. It's 26,000 words. And it's
Nope, for Monday.
in. The publisher's disappeared, so I think it's only in online book now. This one character, one issue. Is he going to make it to his retirement function with his taking care of his wife? And he's preparing for a speech for the function. So I would say that's a classic way to write a novella. Next thickest is the novella that you mentioned at the beginning of mine. That's almost 40,000 words. That's like 130 pages of text. That's the far end of what most people would think of as a novella. And like a bookstore or a publisher would probably position this as a novel. So they know where to put it. There's not like a novella section in
I've never seen a novella section in a bookstore. Absolutely. Well, I haven't really seen this short story section, come to think of it. But
so in like my own collection, the next widest thing of my own books, this is a young adult book. This is called a short novel.
okay.
So it's not just novella to novel. There's a novella, short novel, and then novel. And this is almost just a little over 200 pages. Lots of young adult books are that length, but also just on the spine test, you can see they're pretty similar.
As a reader, I have used, my rule of thumb has been if it's 200 pages or less, it's a novella. So that's interesting. But the publishers would, and I think publishers will like to call things that are in a gray area, if they can get away with calling it a novel instead of a novella, that would be their preference.
That's right. So I contacted Kelsey Attard at Freehand Books. She's the managing editor there. And she said, I had always thought the issue was price, that your cost per page for a novella. I probably said it on one of your podcasts even, that's why they don't have them. She said, no, given how expensive it is to print books, actually smaller is better. The issue is marketing, positioning, how to set it up. And that's because either people don't know what a novella is, or they can't think of it as a long, short story. Short stories would be the lowest sales for lots of publishers, the short story collections. So
I would think maybe poetry would be the lowest, and then short stories.
Yeah. So yeah, they would position them as short novels or include them in a short story collection. Or, as I've seen, 2 or 3 in one spine, say 3 novellas. I think I've read that, say, in Gabriel Garcia Marquez. That's how his novellas are packaged and sold. So it's sales. Isn't that sad?
Well, and I think that has a big bearing on this. And to the degree that reflects readers' taste, that's a whole other issue here. And I know we talked about this a little bit in our first chat. So many of my bookish friends, they don't like reading short stories. They say there's not enough. They want more, and they can never remember them. They put it down, and then the next day, they can't remember anything about it. And so that's fine. That's a free country, and people have their own reading tastes. But I think that's why they're not the best selling of what's on offer from the publishers. Is a lot of people just don't like reading short stories, or they don't gravitate towards them. And I think perhaps to a lesser extent, it would be something similar for the novella. What do you think?
I think so. I think I feel like there's a bigger is better, maybe thing lurking around in the subconscious, or the author worked harder, or they're the reason I like them is they're very economical. I've never finished a novella, like in recent recollection anyhow, that I can think, oh, I could have edited some of that out, but I do think that for novels sometimes. And, or I'm reading a novel thinking, I don't know that I care about this part going on here. I want to get back to this other part. So, it's a preference thing. I think novellas have, I was trying to think of like a metaphor or something, but I would think of, say it's an apple. You might have to edit this out, but like a novel would be a full apple. And novella would be the core, and that's why I like it. And then the short story, the seed. Does that work?
It does.
Yeah, well, or a short story is a they say a snapshot or a glimpse or a bit of a larger piece. The novella is pretty satisfying. That doesn't really work with the core, maybe, but you have a good idea of all that's going on, even though that's not contained in the story. And they usually pack some extra punch in terms of tackling a big topic. I'd say the good ones, like happiness or humanity or these things. Maybe all good writing does, but novellas have the room to do that. They're, fable, allegory, Animal Farm kind of stories fall nicely into that category.
Barb, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that Happy Sands, your novella that I loved so much I read it twice in less than 6 months, didn't it start out as a short story?
It did.
That's a good way into, tell us about that evolution, and that'll kind of get us more into what's the difference between the two other than page count.
Yeah, so it sort of ties into the books that I picked too, I think, when I went and read about their backgrounds. Like I had the idea, I wouldn't say it was very first was a short story, it was maybe in a novella first, and I thought, novellas are hard, they're hard to get published. I can make this a short story. I did a short story. It's in my short story collection, and I never felt 100% about it. I guess it's like a singer doing a song and thinking there's just I didn't accomplish what I wanted to accomplish. I know it's not a novel. I know I don't want to go all over with it, but I know I want to explore the main character and Happy Sands as people at a resort. I want more of them than I could fit in a short story. So yeah, so it sort of went, sort of sloppy. What is it? Short story, and then novella, and now I feel done. I say
that's fascinating. That's fascinating. You just talk about something finding its own level, but I would twist that a little bit. Say it's your story needed to find its own length.
Yeah, and I had it's like kind of like a reader looking for my satisfaction from it. And that Notes for Monday, the shorter novella that I wrote, that was a novella, and it was so short at 26,000 words, really hard to find a publisher, and I squashed it down to a short story to get it published so I could send it to publishers and say, hey, there's been some interest in this when it was a short story.
Okay.
So, I think I'm spending a lot of time saying the novella is not a short story, but yeah, then I'm saying I was moving it around from one to the other.
Is a novella more like a short story, or is it more like a novel?
More like a novel.
I think so too.
But I don't know if people buying books think that. Like I don't know that's, I think that's the marketing problem. People think it's a baby novel or something like that, where that's different.
I would like to, at this point, ask viewers to make comments below about, if you don't like short stories, do you have the similar opinion about novellas or not? What is your cutoff? Or do most readers who don't really gravitate towards short stories also have that same issue with novellas, or is a novella long enough that you don't have the same issues? I'd like to be into lots of comments and discussion in the below after this video gets posted. Yeah, it'd be interesting.
I wonder if something about the novella has to do with where you're reading it and the convenience. Like I've had several people say to me, they took Happy Sands on a flight that they knew was long, like across an ocean kind of flight. And it was the perfect size for that. They're finished and they're going on vacation, or they're going someplace else. And then I get a text with or an email or something. And I think, oh, that's not how I pictured it, but that's great. They did it in one sitting. I would say as a writer of novellas, in some circles, sort of like if you write a short story, people will say, are you thinking of writing a novel? Whereas if you were a poet, people don't say, you write a book of poems, people don't say, are you thinking of writing a novel? So there is that, I guess I've referred to it a couple of times, sort of a gradation that I don't think is there in terms of skill level required to write them, or the finished product, the value of it, or the reading significance of it, that sort of thing. I don't get it now so much, but for sure it was like, it's not a practice book, it's a full book. And it's really hard to write. The two novellas that I have are the books that have taken me the longest to write.
I just have this inkling that writing an excellent short story or an excellent novella is even more difficult than writing an excellent novel.
Yeah, or just different. I would say that the short stories, easier to keep a short story in your mind over a period of time. So if you have to work in bits and spurts over a day or something like that, then a short story, or for me, in my past, has been easier to work on than keep a whole novel, what's going on.
But I think it's time to start sharing our 3 picks.
Okay, well, I will start by saying, when we planned to do this talk, I thought, oh, it's okay, I already know what my 3 are. It was Ernest Hemingway, The Old Man and the Sea, and Richard Bach's Jonathan Livingston Seagull, and then Paul Gallico, The Snow Goose. I don't know if he's knowable as an author, but the Snow Goose was famous. And so then I went and reread them to see if they stood the test of time. Well, Jonathan Livingston Seagull, not so much, still holds a close place in my heart, but I don't know why I like that so much. And somehow in the post-pandemic and the current politics, it was rubbing me super the wrong way. I don't know. I guess I'm a sheeple. So, but I think I probably read it in the 70s when I was a teenager, and I felt I was quite a unique flower and that sort of thing. And that's why it appealed, or maybe the music, although I listened to the music today that Neil Diamond did for it. And yeah. So
I don't think I ever read it, but I also didn't, from what I heard about it, it didn't sound like a book that I ever wanted to read, but interesting. Now, you said sheeple. What is a sheeple?
Oh, the people who just go along and do their thing. Well,
but at a certain age, we all did that, right? And I think we did that in the 70s and 80s more than anybody does that now.
Well, but, yeah. I'm probably still a sheeple for a lot of things. I just know the real me now, and but Jonathan Livingston Seagull has all those special flying skills and is very much about the individual overcoming the commonness of your community or something like that. And I would say now I would think, I have a lot of faith in the community and democracy and groups and juries and all those kinds of things. I actually, that's going way deeper than we should be going on this. But anyhow, that's Jonathan.
Oh, no, that's actually really fascinating. So that one's not one of your picks ultimately.
Yeah, and he's also not going to land in an honorable mention. But it is a lot of people's favorite book, so you'll probably get comments on that. And then Ernest Hemingway, The Old Man and the Sea. That's the old guy goes out fishing, catches the biggest marlin ever, and it's more like a sporting story, but also allegory for not just competition, but it's got everything in there, as Hemingway does. Fewer words, more meaning, and lots of stuff. Anyhow, can't bring the marlin home. And the sharks end up eating it before he gets home, and he just has the carcass, sort of. So that's still good, but I think Hemingway is probably my go-to for a long time, a big influence on my writing, as I'm sure he is on many. I love that minimalism, but I bumped Ernest Hemingway too off my list of top. I don't know. I thought I could dig a little deeper, but I kept one. I kept this. The Snow Goose. First on my list is The Snow Goose, not ranking, but in my top 3. Yeah. And I'm kind of embarrassed I kept this. I mean, there are references that this is one of the most sentimental books ever written. You'll know it because the main character lives in an abandoned lighthouse, has a hunchback, and a disabled hand, So here we go. And then, and he's an artist, of course. And then there's a young girl from a local town, Fritha, who come to meet him. This is interesting. I've seen on the internet, it's certainly not on the book that I have. It's called A Story of Dunkirk. So it's a wartime story, and that's kind of fascinating. The language in it is fascinating for me. And the snow goose is the reason I always loved this. And that's why it stays on my list. So a snow goose is actually a North American Canadian bird. And in this story, it's a big storm happens. We don't know this. It's just like in a sentence how you figure out how the snow goose ends up in Essex, where this story takes place in like 1940. So this snow goose lands, and this guy in the lighthouse, he takes care of birds. He tends injured birds. He paints birds. He's based loosely on some famous ornithologist. Anyhow, the snow goose is there, and then it turns into, they end up being part of the evacuation of Dunkirk. Oh, okay. And the girl and the guy, I mean, today's standards, just no on the age difference and no on the theme of love in there. But for me, the love in terms of friendship in this book is super touching. I don't care how sentimental it is. It's a beautiful book.
It was originally published in 1940.
Yes, and this I would have got this from my parents' bookcase. This is the original. I didn't know until we did this podcast. This is 1940. And talking about short stories, this was originally a short story in the Saturday Evening Post, and then he expanded it to a novella, which is kind of neat. Just what you were talking about.
Absolutely. Have you read the original short story?
I haven't. I don't even know if I could find it. This is 57 pages. It's very, very big print.
Right.
And there might even be a version with some drawings in it somewhere. Yeah. That's the one I stuck with from my original list.
And he's famous for the Poseidon Adventure, which was a famous movie in the 70s, was it not? Yeah.
Was he? I didn't know.
Do you remember that novel, The Poseidon Adventure? I never saw it, but when I hear Paul Gallico, I think Poseidon Adventure. It was published in 1969 about a ocean liner that capsizes.
Yeah. Oh, I know this story. I didn't know he
kind of a Titanic.
Did he write the screenplay or something?
He wrote the novel, and then the movie was based on the novel. Now that I'm looking at Wikipedia, this is not all stuff that's in my head, but I'd never heard of the snow goose, so that that's quite intriguing.
Well, this is I guess one of the best-selling novellas of all time, but I don't think most people would have heard of it. It would have been more my parents' generations, and maybe because it's uplifting story, and also it's no surprise. It is sentimental. The snow goose has something to do with spirit, inner spirit. You kind of see it coming through the whole way through, and I don't care. I'm putting it on my list.
So you were quite the birder / reader back in the day.
The what reader?
Bird watching.
Well, the first three that I chose, weirdly, all ocean stories. Yeah. All had, like seagulls in them. And I am born and bred Alberta, Calgary girl. Maybe I just felt the need to get away. I don't know. I found that very odd. It's actually why I chose to reread them and choose a few more things.
So I'm choosing my most obscure pick first, and because I hope that more people will read it. This is a Welsh novel, Anglo-Welsh, published in English, but it's a Welsh novel from 1932, and it's called Country Dance by Margiad Evans. And I just read it a few years ago, and it is one of the best novellas that I've ever read, and it's certainly my favorite work of Welsh literature. Margiad Evans is a pen name for an English writer who lived and grew up on the border between Wales and England, but she identified with the Welsh. She was, ethnically or whatever, she was English, but she just loved everything about Wales. So this is her Welsh pen name, and all of her fiction is set on the borders. And this is the borderiest novel in terms of theme and structure and writing. And it is a novella. It's about 100 pages long. It's set in 1850. And the protagonist, Anne, has a Welsh mother and an English father. So there's all that ethnic mix is at the heart of the protagonist and the heart of the story. And she is being courted in 1850 by an Englishman and a Welshman. And there's lots of Welsh that is not translated in the text, and that makes it an incredibly fascinating, it's almost like a post-colonial type of reading experience, because there's a scene where her mother dies. That's not a spoiler. She's very ill at on page 1. And she was Welsh, but lived on the English side of the border with her English husband and spoke English and so on. But as she was on her deathbed, she lost English and she could only speak in Welsh. And there's something about the way Margiad Evans renders that scene that is it's just one of the most linguistically fascinating passages in all of modern literature, I think, because the mother is speaking in Welsh to her husband who doesn't understand Welsh. And Margiad Evans is giving us her side of the dialogue in English. At the same time as the daughter, the protagonist, is feeding her father, monoglot, her father who only speaks English. She's feeding her father Welsh expressions, tender Welsh expressions to say to the mother, and we're getting those on the page in Welsh, and they're not translated. And I don't know if that lights you up the way it lights me up, but it's just one of the most interesting things about this novel is the play between the two cultures and the two languages. And those are the things that make it such a fascinating read. The plot is, you kind of know where the plot's going. It ends tragically. It's a tragic love story. And that's almost beside the point, or at least it was in my reading. There's another scene where there's Welsh people and English people sitting at the bar or sitting around a table. And one of the English characters proposes a toast to England, and one of the Welsh characters proposes a toast to Wales, and then another character, and I think that might have been another mixed Welsh-English mixed person, does a toast to the border. So borders. And the last thing I'll say about it is most of the Welsh characters in the story live on the English side of the border, and most of the English characters in the story live on the Welsh side of the border. So there's just all this stuff. It's just absolutely fascinating. Have you heard of Margiad Evans? I certainly hadn't.
I have not. Is the country dance, I assume it's a metaphor for a lot of things going on. Is there a country dance in it?
There is a country dance in it. Yes. And it's also written, much of it is written in a journal or diary form. And the protagonist, her jealous English boyfriend, demands that she keep this diary so that he can check up on what she's doing. Here's the opening couple sentences. Gabriel gives me this book, telling me to write in it all I do for him to see until we shall be married. And when that will be, I do not know, since I am to leave 12 poplars and look to my mother. So there's a whole bunch of stuff, gender-wise, all kinds of things going on in the format that it's presented to the readers. I don't know if that's the one you're going to pick, but I would die to hear your thoughts on it if you ever did read it.
It's on my list.
What's your second pick?
Okay, my second pick, well, maybe the next two picks, but my second pick came out mostly from a writer's standpoint. I had, when I'm like exercising on a stationary bike, I think, could a whole story take place on a stationary bike while you're pedaling? Like, would that be like, not like a short story? Yeah, I think I could do that, but like a novella. So one of my more recent reads, which I love, is this book, The Rider. So this is by Tim Krabbé, I think is how you say his name. I don't know. I think I'm trying to say it French, but it's Dutch. It's a translation. It's one of the most read books by cyclists in the world, still, for people who race bicycles. I do not race bicycles, but it's one of their, what would you say, like Bibles or manuals or have you read it kind of books. So I'd say the author is a extra good chess player. I'm not sure the exact term, so I'll use the wrong one if I said master. I'm sure not. He took up road cycling when he was 29. This is fiction, this book, but because he did this road cycling, he has a lot of details that you wouldn't have otherwise. It takes place in France, and it's a race. That's all it is. It is the arrival at the race, what goes on in his head. Each kilometer, something is going on. So I think it's 134 kilometers or 137 kilometers. But it is audacious, and for me, the writing it, just to go for it and have what's in your head for a whole bike race. I mean, there's some weird stuff. And what I love about this is he'll see someone at the start line and say, oh, that guy, he's pretty good. And then when that guy passes him, like, I hate that guy, his parents bought his bike, or like, it does all the immature thoughts, all the super big, wide thoughts about the world that a person could have pedaling that long. And then there's something about the translation that is really working for me. They're not some of the terms, when they see someone, the translator has kept I think one of the words they say a lot is, hey ho, here comes someone here. It makes me feel like I'm not in a Canadian bike race. I'm in a European bike race. So I guess
was it published?
1978, but I think it was not translated till 2002. And then, yeah, just keeps going. I don't know how many printings it's had. And I don't know what other books Tim Krabbé has written. I'm particularly interested in this one. And I think that sports event, like The Old Man and the Sea, fishing, or this, I think they are, novellas are excellent vehicles for sports. A whole novel based on one race, just the race, not the preparation stuff too much. Who cares? But this one, yeah, working for me. The first two sentences are well known in the crowd. Do you want to hear them?
Yes, please.
I guess it's called a cult classic. That's what I'm saying here. It's a 5-hour bike race. So this is from, I don't know how to say the words, Marais, Lozère, France, 1977, June 26. Hot and overcast. I take my gear out of the car and put my bike together. Tourists and locals are watching from sidewalk cafes, non-racers. The emptiness of those lives shocks me. So that's the guy's attitude. It is both appalling, and then kind of funny. And then, as you'd expect, he has his moments where he's just, as any sort of long distance sporting event, where he is lower than low, taking all that back, wishing he was those people, all of that going on. I think it's done really well.
This is a very recent novella, which immediately went to the top of my favorite novella list. And it's the title novella from a collection. So this is this hybrid one novella plus short stories. And it is by an African-American writer, The Office of Historical Corrections by Danielle Evans. It's quite new, like 2 or 3 years ago, 2020, yeah. And I have read her debut collection of short stories, Before You Suffocate Your Own Fool Self, which I loved. And I love this too. So she's now one of my favorite writers. Once I've read 2 books that I just totally love by the same writer, they go to that pantheon. And I'm just going to talk about the novella. Let's see, it is 108 pages or something. The Office of Historical Corrections in the world of this story. So it's a little bit, I don't say slipstreamy. There's nothing magical realism about it, but it's a fictional thing that exists in American society in the world of this story. It was created by a congressman, I think a one-term congressman or woman, who shepherded it through, got a budget for it. And the purpose of the Office of Historical Corrections in the States is to correct historical misinformation whenever it appears in whatever aspect of society, whether it's in advertising or in a politician's speech or anywhere in culture. These people that work for this government office, they go around with their little handheld printers to print the correct version of the history that's been mangled, to put it over the ad, or to put it, or it must be printed in the paper. And it's not big brotherish at all. In the world of this story, it comes across as something that, boy, we actually kind of need this right now. Like, it's not heavy-handed. They're not, if something's controversial, they stay away from it. But if there's clear facts that are being misstated for any reason, ignorance or political partisanship or whatever, they swoop in and say, no, this is the true story. Ultimately, this being a modern American tale by an African-American writer, a lot of the stuff that they're trying to correct is about race. And the protagonist of this novella works for that office. And we first meet her when she goes into a bakery where they have muffins that are commemorating Juneteenth. And they describe Juneteenth as commemorating the Emancipation Proclamation, which isn't true. Juneteenth actually commemorates I think it was about, a year and a half later, where the news of the Emancipation Proclamation reached Texas. And that was in June every year, but it was like at least a year later. So she has to go and she prints out her little printer and puts it over the poster advertising these muffins. So it's kind of humorous, kind of not humorous. And we get so many aspects of her personal life, including her frenemy from childhood, who then much later became a co-worker at the Office of Historical Corrections and got fired because she took things too far. And she waded into controversial issues there was no consensus about what it was, and she got ahead of her skis. And it's about the protagonist's interracial romantic relationship. She has a white ex and a black ex, or I think they break up during the story, and there's all these dimensions to it. And it's just one of the smartest, most exciting, most social politically relevant works of fiction that I've read in a long, long time. And it's a novella, The Office of Historical Corrections.
And why do you think it was novella? Like, do you think it could have been a novel, or do you think, like, because it sounds like there's a lot there.
Now that's interesting.
Would you have wanted to read more? I guess that's, or did it feel done?
It felt done. It felt the perfect length. And if it had been more compressed into just a short story, like a 40-page short story, it would have been too short. So it was just like what you were talking about with Happy Sands. It's just perfect length. Now, I don't have a better answer. I'm going to think about that. I might have more to say about that when we come back for our second chat, because I hadn't thought of that. Would I have wanted more? I didn't. It felt complete. I felt deeply satisfied by it. So I think I would stick with that answer, but I'm going to think about it some more. Maybe even reread it to think. Could it have been longer? What's next on your list?
Okay, so my third pick, I went to one that was also meaningful to me as a writer. A true story.
Oh, I love that book.
Oh, yay. So
it's not on my list, but it sure could have been.
Yeah, it's 1976. The author Sharon Riis died 2016.
Know that.
She is from Longview, Alberta, which is right near where I live. And this story, main character, most of it, sort of I guess the bookending story is the main character, Ida, is a waitress in a diner in Longview, and person comes in and says she or he will buy her breakfast and would like to hear Ida's story. So that sounds a little bit of a corny prompt, but it actually works for what's going on in this story. And it's about perceptions and judgments and what's the truth from whose eyes. And I don't know if you put little stars on things. I mean, there is like a fire involving children and things like that. So it's not for everybody to read, but it is beautiful in the way it's written in these very small cinematic sections. And I think it was Ian McEwan in one of those articles that we read before this saying that screenplays are about 20,000 words And then novellas often resemble screenplays or have a feel about them like screenplays. And I would say this one does as well.
So long since I read it, but I remember loving it. And I heard her read from it when I lived in Edmonton, late 80s, early 90s. That's when I was living in Edmonton. And she was so interesting. And one of the things I remember so vividly was that it was the time when non-smoking was becoming more and more as kind of the rule, the regulation, the law. And she lit up a cigarette. She said, I don't care what any of you think, I'm going to smoke. Because, if you're worried about your health, we're all going to die someday. And she smoked and talked about her book and read a scene that I don't remember well, except that she read it so wonderfully. And there was so much humor in it. But it was also kind of controversial because it was, I guess, Ida, but some younger woman having sex with a very elderly gentleman and finding it to be very, very pleasurable.
Yeah, she's not afraid to talk about sex either. And then it's playing with people's perceptions of sex for love, sex for money, and some of those things too. And making it sound harsher in that category than it is, but it's a really powerful book. And that hasn't received its due. I always like to talk about a book that hasn't received its due.
I'm so glad you brought it up because I haven't thought about it. I don't know where my copy is, and I have a signed copy. I hope it's in a box at my parents' farm. I hope it is. Pretty much already decided that I'm going to reread that one before we chat again. Yeah.
Did you have it for an English class and then just...
No, I was just at a stage in life where I was coming into my bookish selfhood, and I would, anytime there was a literary reading at Edmonton, I would go, and I usually went alone and got the book signed. I remember, I think it might have been a series, like there was 4 different writers a year, because one of the other writers that I'm so glad that I got to hear before he died was Matt Cohen.
Oh.
I didn't read anything by him for many years after I saw him there, but I finally did, and I love this stuff. It didn't live much longer after I saw him. So
it was had trouble getting published. It was originally published by the Toronto Women's Press. Now this version is Douglas and McIntyre. So yeah.
And that's the edition I have or had. Yeah. I have saved the best for last, even though I love those 2 novels that I've talked about deeply. This is one of my favorite works of literature in any genre. You know what's coming because we talked about this earlier, but A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr, a 1980 British novella. It was nominated for the Booker, and I have read it 3 times. There aren't very many books that I've read 3 times, and especially books that I'm chomping at the bit to read it a 4th time. Like, it's just the work of fiction that I will be rereading for the rest of my life. It's set in 1920 in Yorkshire, and the protagonist is just a couple of years back from the war. He has been disfigured and has a lot of shell shock type symptoms. He is an art restorer, and he's been commissioned, I think he was in London, but certainly from a bigger city down south, to come up north to this tiny little village, Oxgodby, to uncover a medieval mural on the church wall inside the church that in the intervening centuries, various pastors or whatever thought it should be covered up for any number of political or spiritual reasons. What it depicted didn't stand the test of time in terms of what was acceptable theologically. But some old lady in the town has died, and she left money for this project. And so he's been hired, and he shows up in town not knowing a soul, and he lives in the church, and he works all day uncovering it, and has a lot of thoughts about what he's doing and what he's uncovering that sweep the reader back into history. And he gets into relationships with the townspeople, who are colorful characters, including the beautiful young vicar's wife. And whenever I try to describe this novella, I say it's about everything. It's about history, it's about art, sexuality, friendship, community. And it's just, I don't know how he fit so much into 125 pages, but it is one of the best works of fiction ever written, in my humble opinion. And right now, I've just started, as a buddy read, a biography of the author, J.L. Carr. That's how much I love this book.
So I bought this because I knew you were going to pick it, and
Yes.
I had to like put it under a stack of paper under lock and key. So I
So you
wouldn't.
didn't
So now
dip into it?
tonight I can open it. I didn't want to read
Now,
it today. Thought I was cheating.
so yeah, we've kind of agreed that we're going to read one of the other's lists. So, but with that, we're also free to read more than one if we so choose. But the homework will be considered complete if we have read one, and we'll come back in a month or two. And I think if I could only choose one, that would be to reread Sharon Riis's novel. But I think I'm going to try to read it and the Paul Gallico.
Yeah,
Because it
the
sounds
Paul
really
Gallico one is, a short novella. I've just created a new category to make
It's
things
a short novella.
Yeah, you can read it.
It's a novelette.
Yeah, yes, let's go.
And the biking race one sounds pretty darn interesting too, but maybe less so to me because I'm not sports minded. But
Yeah,
I'd like to try to get those two.
Before we go, I would mention
Editing Shawn here. 45 minutes is long enough, so Barb and I went on for another 20 minutes talking about other novellas that we loved. And I'm not going to delete that footage. I'm just going to put it in a separate video on my Patreon. It'll be on there with, in a largely unedited format one day soon. Now let's go to the wrap-up of this chat.
At the end of this conversation, Barb, I'm going to spring something off you, and I'm curious about what your gut reaction is, but there's no it would be ridiculous for either one of us to commit to this, but I think we might need to do this annually.
Oh, yeah. Like a novella?
A novella reading kind of series of these kind of 3 a year, or 3 that we've read in the last year, and then we read one and come back for a second video.
That.
We'll see how it goes. But what a wonderful chat, Barb. Thank you so much.
Oh, that was fun. Thanks, Shawn.